When you have a look at what we're talking about now, we're talking about the future and where we believe that in the future things will be looked at very differently, both from man versus machine. And in the context of which I talk this morning, it has to focus on two areas. One, how this will impact on my business, which is driver training, and therefore any other organization that embraces driver training. And the second and more important component is how safe it is. Now, when we heard Colin talk earlier, it was Colin, eh? He was talking about, it's great, we can do these things, but where is the moral responsibility? So when we have a look at some of the things that we talk about, one of the areas that we've looked at fairly deeply is whether or not there's a correlation between the aircraft industry, the automation of aircraft, and we know what's happened with the 737 MAX in recent times, and where it applies to vehicles in terms of autonomous mode. Like it or not, you or I are probably driving an autonomous vehicle at one or other level at the moment in any case. But as to whether or not we can get where they believe we should be in the time frame that we're looking at, and I'll show you the last frame, the last slide, which it talks to where they think autonomous vehicles can be operating efficiently. But there's three areas that I'd like you to bear in mind when we talk about autonomous vehicles. The three things that in a South African context that could present a problem. One of them is stable power. The second, 5G capacity, to not have interrupted signals. And then the third one is, of course, an infrastructure which the cameras can then read. So given that, if you had to project 5 years down the line, what road infrastructure would be able to handle any autonomous vehicle? But that's not to say it's a bad thing, because in many ways there are several safety factors. Looking at that aircraft over there, probably seats about 400. Look what's happened to aircraft travel in recent years, and if I can just highlight that one area over there. This is probably about the time when a lot of research that went into creating autopilots on planes had a dip. Because what they found, and I've got a great paper there if you want to get a copy of it at some stage, how this can relate to what autonomous vehicles can learn from what happened in the airline industry. So that the training that's done for pilots nowadays in many instances is not about the fact that they can fly a plane, but when it is an autopilot, what to watch for that could be a potential problem. So in our mind, that principle would also apply to vehicles. So when they see a picture, or when you see a picture of a guy sitting in the car reading a magazine, I really believe that we're very, very far from that in terms of safety and the moral obligation that rests on each and every one of us. Just if you have a look at that plane, by the way, that plane, the amount of crashes that we have in South Africa is equivalent to one of those crashing every 10 days. Now, would you agree that if that happened in South Africa, we would have a phenomenal move by government to change that? But that's how many people we kill every year on our roads, and very little is done about it. So let's just talk about a couple of the things that I'd like to share with you. The aero industry, what we can learn from that, modern technology, and in fact, if you have a look at it, there's some interesting statistics that would actually relate to one of the things that we talk about, Smeed's Law, and then homeostasis, risk homeostasis, and that in fact is part of where you're sitting as well. Hayden matrix, psychometric profiling, and the role that telematics plays in the business that we do. So, there's the average cost of a truck, and I've chosen to work with trucks for now, because that's the type of numbers that really kills an operator. If you look at the fuel cost, it probably represents about 50% of the operating costs. So when you have a crash, it really has serious business. Figures that mentioned about human behavior contributing toward 90% of the crashes that we have on the road. So now, if you think about that statistic, will that human behavior be decreased, or the statistic decreased to a significant level by the introduction of autonomous vehicles? I'll show you a slide on platooning. Colin mentioned Peloton in the United States. Really a great example of how autonomous vehicles could work to some degree or other. And then, of course, 30% of commercial truck crashes are caused as a result of fatigue. Vehicle technology, 2019, this was the number of remarkable introductions in terms of vehicle technology that was introduced. The ones that are underlined is really the ones that in the corporate world running fleets are the ones that make a real difference. So let's delve into some of them. There you see CAB, which is the design of vehicles, a couple of comments on platooning, the technology in cameras, and how they're able to use it. One of the previous presentations showed how we can change the behavior of driver by introducing a training mechanism. And then, of course, that leads us to the point where man against machine. Every one of us has got a built-in level of danger that we're prepared to accept in our life. You agree? It's interesting when you have a look at what was developed by Professor Wilde in his theory on risk homeostasis, and there he goes on to show that everyone accepts a certain level of risk in return for the benefits that they would get from it. Now, typically, if I've got a reasonably sized audience, I would be asking how many smoke. Is there anybody that smokes here? Okay. You won't mind if I just work with you for a moment. Do you think it's a good habit? No. Do you enjoy it? Yeah, absolutely. I'm grateful that you're honest. But you do realize that there will be a price to pay. Now, think about that in this context. This man knows that it's bad to smoke, it's bad for his health. His wife probably doesn't like kissing him because that's not a good one. It's not a good turn on. Now, apply that in the business context where we're using cell phones. Everybody knows that it's wrong to use a cell phone. And please don't let's debate whether it's hands-free or not. It's equally as dangerous because the brain cannot focus cognitively on two equally important tasks simultaneously. It's not about the hand being off the wheel or the eyes off the road for up to 5 seconds, but it's the fact that the brain can't process all of it. And you'll notice in the slide I'll share with you on platooning how this actually negates that problem that we have with regard to paying attention. So we take a phone and we use it because we know it will give us business. I phone you that I'm running late because your business is really important to me. But you know, and I know that there's risk attached to that. You could face a fine, you could be involved in a crash or something like that. So we were prepared to take the risk or the benefits of that risky activity in exchange for the benefits. Now that is what drives human behavior. The challenge that we must get is how do we get that to the middle? And in fact, there is no middle path when it comes to be distracted while driving. They contribute toward 25% of the crashes on the roads around the world on average. So what do we do? The research shows that particularly in the commercial vehicle market, the second largest cause of fatal crashes is as a result of transport-related incidents. Now, the transport tonnage in the UK or in the European Union is increasing by that amount every year since 2013, 60%. And when you have a look at that, and they contribute toward the number of fatalities on the road is recorded over there at 15%. The research that's been done at the moment shows that because of the motorization of trucks, now think about it from a platooning point of view, the more trucks on the road get delivery from point A to point B, from the big stuff, from the big factory to the small factory, is causing that over there. Notice what the result is, that it has given us greater exposure to accidents. The second thing that we notice, the development of a better infrastructure and vehicles that are on our roads. And you have to admit, where the seatbelt was the first innovation that contributed toward road safety, the innovation that we have today with regard to all the technology contributes significantly toward that. However, share an experience with you. Everybody know what ABS is? Absolutely. A survey done on the road, on the N3 between Joburg and Durban, the results showed that 70% of people who questioned didn't know what ABS was. Can you imagine in this world in which we live that you wouldn't know that? But here's the kicker. The remaining 30%, 10% of those who had tried ABS said it didn't work. Now you can kind of wonder how is that possible? Well, remember old technology, initial stages, you put your foot on the brake hard and you had a pulsating effect. The result was they thought the brakes were deficient, they took their foot off the brake, and as a result they rode into the car in front of them. So in their mind it didn't work. Now, is that a simple thing to change? I'm sure you'll agree, yes. When you buy a vehicle, ask the salesman what is the safest thing about the car, and he says it's the bright yellow color that you've got there. They don't really understand what they're talking about. So it's an educational process that we have to engage in so that individuals can see the benefits. Now, Smead's law is interesting in that I think he died in 1976. He postulated that with the increase in traffic, fatalities should decrease. kind of doesn't make sense on occasion. But what does reality tell us? Look what happened in London. In 1950, 4.4 million vehicles, 1 for every 11 people. 2010, 1 for every 2 people. Have a look at what happened to fatalities in 1950, 5,012 deaths. Look what happened in 2010, 1850. A 63% reduction in fatalities, even though traffic had increased phenomenally on the roads. So today, we cannot say that increased traffic should be justified reasons why we have more fatalities. In fact, if anything, that law shows that we shouldn't be. So, what do we attribute most of the problems to? Namely, driver error. And the one interesting thing that I've always found, when we approach corporates, and you talk to them about analyzing the risk, no, we've got telematics. We've got cameras. I often use the example of when you're talking about a camera. It's gone. There we are. When you're talking about a camera and what you can do with that in order to change the driver behavior. Yes, he can look at it and you can attribute the cause of the crash to speeding. But does he understand the context and what was behind what caused him to do so? There could be an emotional component. And the analogy that I use there is of an apple pie. Would you agree that any one of us, given the recipe, could bake an apple pie? It's simple, isn't it? But if I take the lady there, and your name is? Yes. Leona. You married? Okay. You've got a boyfriend? You've got a parent? You go and bake an apple pie for them for their anniversary or their birthday or something like that. Can I ever put the love and the feeling into the baking methodology that you've had when you prepared it? Never. So there's things that are subtle behind the scenes that we have to take into account when working with drivers, and it's not always off the top that we can see it. There's the truck of today, the technology that we see. It governs virtually every facet of our life. But does that negate the need for drivers to be trained with a view to changing behavior? Haddon Matrix, if you have a look at that, it gives pre-event and it goes all the way through to socio-economical factors. But what is of interest? When you have a look at the driver skills, and yes, they talk about drunken driving, something that's tolerated in South Africa, because it's considered to be a man thing. However, that can be addressed by changing behavior. And the area that we want to focus on is that area, pre-event. Driver skills, driver attentiveness, and sobriety. We're busy with CSIR at the moment on a research project on the use of cannabis. Now, we all know that drivers in South Africa have used cannabis forever, huh? But given the fact that it's now legal, what impact will that have? Because whilst company policies may override your freedom to use it in your own home, we cannot at this stage begin to estimate how much of an impact that will have on our driving force. So the CSIR is busy on a research project. We're providing some of the data, and I hope that we can start getting that fact, instead of just thinking about drunken driving, driving under the influence of drugs. Psychometric assessment. Interesting when you start looking at what makes up a driver profile. Many people, when we talk to them, are fully aware of what the requirements are for a driver to drive properly and defensively. And I use the one example to measure situational risk. Most everybody is aware that there's the correct following distance that one should have behind the vehicle in front. We probably know it, whether we call it 3 cars, which is wrong, okay, but it's more like 3 seconds to 4 seconds. Now, you know that, eh? Would you agree? Just picture you driving on the highway and you're late for an appointment, but you're very good, eh? So you're 3 seconds behind the car in front of you, and then a taxi cuts in. So what do? You back off, eh? Then another one cuts in, and another one, and another one. What do you eventually do? Forget this, and I close the gap. Now, you'll appreciate what has happened. From a situational point of view, you are well aware of what the right thing was to do. Introduce another element at a psychological level, and your risk profile changes considerably. So if we can measure that, and we talk about measuring the driver's appetite for risk, Cranfield University in the UK is the one we work with over there. So have a look at this over here. When we look at the brain, and the area that we really want to focus on is this area over here, the frontal lobe. Because if you think about, when you talk about training a driver, driving is 85% mental and only 15% physical. Most every one of us from an early age can get used to how to change the gears, eh? Clutch, manual, and with auto today, it's even more simple. 15% is physical, 85% mental. Why then, in most organizations, when we look at their risk, they attend to something like 80% of physical training and only 20% mental? The reason why we have to look at that seriously is because look what's happening at the frontal lobe. Reasoning and planning, problem solving, emotions and judgment. They talk about that's where the executive decisions are made with regard to driving. And I'll give you a typical example. If you're driving through a suburb and you see a ball bouncing down the driveway, what would probably you conclude? That there's a child following, eh? Okay. However, a person starting out in driving, if they've never driven through a suburb where there's never been a ball for the children to play, would they understand that? Clearly not. So when we engage with changing behavior, we've got to tap into what is happening in that frontal lobe. And that is what having a psychometric test actually will do for us. Just watch this brief video. This is what you will see. Now you'll notice the points that it covers. There's areas over there of driving appetite, speeding appetite. There's driving excitement, driving fatigue, and a whole host of other factors that would contribute toward analyzing your risk. And it's divided up into a chart that reflects that over there. I've got the Geotab one for later so that you can actually see there's a little bit of a correlation between what Geotab will show you by way of a driver's risk given to the way he drives in relation to the psychometric analysis. What is really interesting though, when it's used as a pre-employment check, you can sometimes weed out the person because they're not suited to the job. Everybody's probably heard of the Hawthorne effect. If people are aware of the fact that they've been observed, they tend to behave better. So when you choose to send your driver out or the potential driver out with somebody who's viewing their training or viewing their driving, they probably will drive pretty well because they're aware of the fact that they would need to get a job. However, when they drive on their own, they change completely. So in some instances we found we can't even train that individual because they could be psycho. You break out into a mad rage and there's a road rage incident. But what it does help you to do is to determine whether or not that person is worth employing, or more importantly, if they are on the payroll already, you can determine which are the areas that you need to train. And that's where we've taken our training slightly differently, because we don't just provide a generic training program based on the telematics data that we get. It could be information from cameras and a number of other sources. We can then create bespoke training programs that use that to give us this full circle of training effectiveness to the point, and you saw some of the numbers there, we can reduce crashes by up to 50%. What I liked about this, and that's the circle that I made mention of, if there's a correlation, and typically we would work well with a company that can give us the data so that we can start with you beforehand, because sometimes the claims that are made by organizations, I will save you 50% on your crashes. How do I know that you're not a good company already? So if we understand what the problems are that you have, we can address those specifically, and then the beauty of it is measure post-effectiveness. So telematics feedbacks, just a couple of comments that we've done research on. You'll notice the high number of people, 38% hasn't changed the way they drive. 38% have made small changes. And the numbers, only 18% that's used this to change their behavior. So in many instances, organizations recognize we need to do a little bit more. And when they start analyzing what is telematics about, sometimes they don't take account of the effect, as those 2 points there. The effect that they've been observed, and you'll see guys who install fatigue machines, if they've been analyzed or monitored prior to it being, or it's been done covertly, you see all these incidents occurring. When they're advised that it's actually doing it overtly, those number of instances reduce significantly. So it's not necessarily the machine that makes a change, but it's aware of the fact that they are being observed. So let's have a look then at what is happening in truck technology and where we can engage differently. And as you will notice from that picture, the driver is pretty much still very much in control, even though the devices that are controlling the vehicle are operating fully. And when we start now looking at platooning, and in fact, Peloton, as I indicated, are running these programs already. I don't know if this video will play, but I'll happily share it with you, because what it shows you is how we can change our fuel consumption, how we can change reaction times, and in all likelihood mitigate the likelihood of a rear-end collision, because as a result of that we see that's areas over there, one truck behind the other, running in a platooning mode. Notice what's happened over there. That small section over there is what gives you your 5% saving on the truck in the front and about 4% on your saving on the truck at the back. That's a considerable number. Peloton at this stage are only working with where it's like fleets, but they're looking forward to the opportunity when they can have multiple fleets operating in a platooning mode. As to where we're heading, you'll notice those are the numbers. But I'd like to share with you one of the serious things that we've come across in all our research. The threat matrix, when we start looking at what could happen to the whole system, in fact, your airline industry could be affected. Have a look what happened in 1959, a solar flare left Quebec. In 89, electric-less for 9 hours. Why? There's a small picture of what it would look like. And notice when you start comparing the Earth down the bottom over here. That solar flare around the Earth causes the following to take place. And it has an impact on that. So when we start looking at autonomous vehicles, that's one of the factors that we have to take into account. What happens if there's a solar flare that disrupts all communication? Can you imagine the chaos? It's one of those moral factors that Colin was talking about. And if you had to put that into a threat matrix, you will notice over here, power supply in South Africa would be critical. The second one, 5G. The third one, very high infrastructure. And then, of course, the threat of something happening by way of a solar flare is there, but it needs to be considered. There's an interesting one I shared at a health and safety conference a little while ago. And the one thing that is not taken into account is what the technology that we're building into the cab of the truck is going to have on the health of the driver. Think about that. The amount of radiation that's been exuded has the possibility of creating blood pressure problems and a number of other factors. So when we talk optimistically from a safety point of view, yes, it is. It's fantastic. But what the manufacturers haven't as yet uncovered is how does a vehicle make a moral decision between saving the occupant of the vehicle and running into a bunch of people standing at a bus stop. It is incapable of making that decision, and until they can resolve that, there will always be a moral issue that people feel about autonomous vehicles. And so, in conclusion, that is just where we've taken technology. If you ever have the opportunity, come and drive this monster. We actually put a man in that machine, and we change his behavior to the point where, in one customer's case, we saved them 80 million rand in 1 year. So behavior needs to be addressed in addition to the use of technology that will help. So thank you very much.